I want to welcome everyone to Visionary Conversations, this first session of this academic year. My name is David Barnard. I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Manitoba, and I'll be moderating the session this evening. I want to thank our Alumni Association for its partnership on this and all of our other Visionary Conversation sessions, and welcome you all to Homecoming 2012. This is really part of a very busy week for us at the university, with lots of other interesting things happening as well. So we're pleased you're here. I want you to enjoy other aspects of Homecoming if you have the opportunity to do so. This is the first session, as I mentioned, for the academic year 2012-2013. And it's an award-winning adventure that we're on here together. This spring, the Visionary Conversations series was recognized as the best university community outreach program by the Canadian Council for Advancement in Education. So I want to congratulate the team. I want to congratulate the team who organized it, who conceived of it, put it together, arranged the details, and all of the colleagues who participated, and you, because I see many familiar faces, people who've come to other sessions. Thank you for coming, and hope that you'll come back and join us for other events this year. This has been, as I say, successful because of our faculty and alumni and because of those of you who come in the audience. So to follow tonight's conversation on Twitter, the hashtag is #UMVisionary. Visionary Conversations brings together some of the leading minds at the University of Manitoba for a dialogue with the broader community. That's what we're here for. This year, we're including some distinguished alumni among those leading minds, recognizing both the success of our graduates and their breadth of knowledge and expertise. At the University of Manitoba, we like to think of ourselves as visionaries and trailblazers and innovators and pioneers and mavericks and defenders and so on. You've seen our brand story. Our theme this evening is we need to talk about racism. This is a topic that challenges us to examine our own values and beliefs and whether we've achieved progress in building a society that embraces diversity and promotes equality. So just a word about format. It's familiar if you've been here before. In case you haven't, each panelist will speak for around 5 to 7 minutes to comment on the discussion theme. They'll use some visual images that'll be on the overhead screen to illustrate their points. And then we'll have a conversation from the floor. I'll look for comments and questions. A couple of colleagues will have wireless microphones. They'll move around. And we'll wrap up the discussion just before 8:30. Vice President Research, Dig Vergias, will give a short summation of some of the key points. I would ask you, if you're wanting to participate, that you raise your hand high and let someone see it, and then you don't need to keep it held. There will probably be more people who want to participate than can at any point in time. So you don't need to sit there with your hand up, but just make sure that one of the people with the microphone notices you, and then we'll take questions as we're able to do so. I did want to indicate that Phil Fontaine was originally scheduled to be part of this panel, but he's unable to attend and sends his regrets. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the first member of the panel tonight. Laurie Wilkinson is an Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts and a Professor of Sociology. She specializes in immigration and refugee studies, particularly on issues related to discrimination, settlement, and health among newcomers to Canada. She's the acting editor of the Journal of Canadian Ethnic Studies, the incoming editor of the Journal of International Migration and Integration. She holds positions in several organizations that specialize in the study of racism and discrimination. She's currently the Vice President of the Canadian Ethnic Studies Association and the Economic and Labor Market Domain Leader for the Prairie Metropolis Centre. Please join me in welcoming Laurie Wilkinson.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for picking this topic, because I think as Canadians we really need to talk about racism, and that's why you're all here. A lot of the things that sociologists do and other people who do research in this area know that racism and discrimination shape Canadian society. Poverty, mental health, physical health, access to education, and a sense of belonging are all shaped to some degree or another by the color of your skin, your ethnic ancestry, the language you speak, and the accent that you speak with. Racism takes a multitude of forms, but we can think about racism as being in two parts, either parts that are related to the individual or directed towards the individual, and parts that are directed to the institution. So individual racism is the one that most people are the most familiar with. These are the kinds of acts that involve name-calling, vandalism, physical violence, that sort of thing. They're usually very overt, so you know that they're happening, and people around you know that they're happening, and they're quite measurable. The institutional sort of racism is more covert. It's harder to pin down, has to do with messages and perceptions, but also has to do with outcomes as well. So let's talk a minute about the individual type racism, the one that people are most familiar with. This form of racism takes the form of physical assaults at its extreme, to things like vandalism, property destruction, racial slurs, that sort of thing at the other extreme. Now, the latest figures from Statistics Canada show that of all the hate crimes that are committed in Canada, 52% are committed on the basis of race. If we wanted to add in religion, because there's racial overtones there as well, you add another 29% to that figure. So a total of 81% of all hate crimes that are committed in Canada have to do with religion or race. We also know that few of these crimes are ever reported. According to the 2009 General Social Survey, only 34% of these kinds of crimes are ever reported to the police or to the media. There's also a feeling amongst Canadians, because we have a Multiculturalism Act, we have several pieces of legislation dealing with employment equity, that sort of thing, that this doesn't happen in Canada. And so I often find myself arguing with people, even at this very university, that racism exists, it happens, and it has real consequences. So I'm going to show you an example of an overt kind of racism at a university. This event happened at Homecoming Week last September at HEC Business College in Montreal. And what happened was approximately 15 white students were painted entirely in blackface, dressed in the athletic colors of Jamaica at a pep rally. They were heard chanting, "Smoke more weed." When the news of this incident became public, the school responded by stating that the students were not aware of the controversial history of blackface in English North America. An assertion actually that I think is blatantly false, given the fact that in the center of this photo, which was produced by CTV News, they're holding a monkey. And there's imagery, the imagery and associations with monkeys and people from Africa and the Caribbean are very well known. So the fact that these students pleaded ignorance is, we shouldn't buy that. Incidentally, the students their punishment was to attend a racial sensitivity seminar. Now, I would argue that these kinds of overt, kind of in-your-face, very publicized types of racism, although wicked and evil, represent actually the smallest portion of racism in our society. There is a more viral and pervasive form of racism that's predominant in Canada, and it's the kind that feeds into our thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and the way we organize social life in Canada. This kind of subtle racism is what researchers call the new racism. And the new racism is the belief that it's human nature that people who are the same should just want to hang out together, that they should want to live together and create communities together, and that people who are different should live in other communities, and that when people who are different interact with one another, it causes racial disharmony. Now, these new forms of racism, they tend not to talk about those old forms of racism that are linked to the genome or your racial characteristics, like you heard well into the 1970s. The genome mapping project more or less killed that notion. But it's this idea that people, I guess we can put this in a Canadianism, people of the same feather flock together, sort of thing. But it's this form of racism in which people tend to talk in codes. So you'll often hear people who practice this form of racism, which they may not even realize. They'll say things like, well, I'm just trying to protect Canadian values and a Canadian way of life. Well, that's just simply code talk for your values, your religion, your culture are not like ours, and ours in this case would be white people, or that you don't belong here. And this kind of racism and message is really difficult to detect, but it's this kind of message that shapes the way we look at our society. So I'm going to quickly look at two forms before I get pulled off the stage. This is an example that's probably familiar to many of you. In 2009, the Swiss People's Party was their political platform was based on a referendum to stop the additional minarets of being built in Switzerland. But as you can see from these posters, the images are quite stark. So you've got the white sheep kicking off the black sheep, which is more than just anti-Islam. It's very racist as well. You see the poster beside with the sinister-looking woman in a full veil. But the messages here, even though they're not direct, are pretty strong. And, if you are not Swiss, you don't belong here. Now, if you think that this form of racism is something that's limited to places outside of Canada, I'll bring in some Canadian examples too. I only have time to share one at this point. But in late 2010, the city of Gatineau passed something called the Values Guide for Immigrants, and I'm going to read a little bit for you. In this Values Guide for Immigrants, it suggested that immigrants should refrain from bribing city officials. It also advises that immigrants, as they raise their children should not be subjected to excessive punishment, corporal and sexual abuse, confinement, neglect, forced labor, humiliation, and I find this last one very interestingly, willful malnutrition. Other issues that it discusses regard good hygiene and punctuality. Now, this is one example of many of these values guides that have popped up across North America in the last couple of years. And the code is not only in and of itself very offensive, but it's very dangerous because it promotes stereotypes and violence, these more physical forms of racism, but also these institutionalized forms of racism that shape our thoughts and beliefs. And so this insidious form of racism costs us extremely. It costs us economically. These beliefs, when we hold on to these beliefs, it becomes more difficult for minority groups to get ahead in their jobs, so they might not get promoted or they might not get hired at all. There's evidence to suggest that that's happening in Canada. There's also cost to us as a society. We've got the costs related to unequal access to education, poor healthcare outcomes, and negative or small access to political institutions. Those are just to name 3 of those outcomes. But I think the broader outcome of this form of racism that seeps into our society has to do with social cohesion and social commitment. Because if you are victimized by these forms of racism, how committed can you be to your society? So when we allow these kinds of beliefs to continue, we're marginalizing a group of people, which makes it difficult for us to survive as a nation. And I think that's probably enough for now, and I'll pass the floor over to Andrew.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Our second speaker, Andrew Woolford, is a professor of sociology and social justice and criminology research coordinator at the University of Manitoba, and author of The Politics of Restorative Justice, A Critical Introduction and Between Justice and Certainty, Treaty Making in British Columbia. Andrew is also co-author of Informal Reckonings, Conflict Resolution and Mediation, Restorative Justice and Reparations. His current research includes a manuscript titled Cold Cities, Care and Control in Edmonton and Winnipeg. That can't be right. Cold? Oh. And his Fulbright project, co-founded by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada on boarding residential schools and colonial genocide in the US and Canada. He's also co-editing 2 volumes, one titled Colonial Genocide in Indigenous North America, and the other, The Idea of a Human Rights Museum, with Karen Busby and Adam Muller. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Woolford.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being here. My topic today is genocide and racism, and I'm going to try to deliver at least a couple of points in the time allotted to me. The first is that it's not just these blatant forms of racism that Laurie discussed or that are involved in genocidal situations. It's also the covert ones that she mentioned. Often it's the case that the covert forms of racism can be exacerbated in a genocidal context as the population is being primed and prepared for genocide. The second point is that racism takes on local characteristics. It can't simply be parachuted from without. It draws upon local assumptions, local cultural tendencies, and builds off of that foundation. And the third point would be, it often intersects with other forms of domination or oppression. That racism is not the sole explanatory variable we need to stop genocide. We can't simply stop genocide because it's often entwined with other forms of domination, whether classism, various forms of ethnocentrism that are involved. So with that, to begin, it's worthwhile to think a moment on the groups that are targeted for genocide. In my understanding, the term genocide means more than the killing of individuals en masse. It is rather the attempt to destroy a group as a group, in whole or in part, by attacking the very foundations of their group life. In undertaking genocide, perpetrators often engage in a process of imagining their perceived target as a homogeneous unit. Everyone is the same in the group. They are part of an undifferentiated mass. Through such an act of homogenization, the perpetrator also reinforces the identity of his or her own group by accentuating their perceived difference from the other group who's argued to be tainted or dangerous or inferior, whatever labels are being placed upon that group. In such circumstances, racism is useful to perpetrators of genocide. This is not a how-to on genocide, by the way. I'm just trying to explain. Since it provides one potent means for tarnishing the identity of a despised target group. But as I said, it may be perceived with other forms of dehumanization. Examples of genocidal use of racism are unfortunately widespread. In Rwanda, for instance, German and later Belgian colonizers brought European race science to bear upon the Hutu and Tutsi, transforming these somewhat fluid identities into firm racial categories. With the Tutsi eventually elevated as the genetically superior race, at least in the colonizers' eyes. The Tutsi during the colonial era were the privileged minority elite and benefited from greater educational opportunities and participation in government, amongst other things. But the departure of the Belgian colonizers in 1962 did little to transform the racial differences, although it did allow the Hutu majority to gain power and to begin to assert their own racial domination. Race thus entwined with politics to create a social polarization that would simmer and erupt on and off for the next 32 years, culminating in the 1994 Rwandan genocide. There was blatant racism evident in the genocide, particularly the radio broadcast, the Hutu hate radio broadcast that depicted Tutsi as cockroaches leading up to and during the genocide. And as Tutsi forces grew in neighboring Uganda and began to present a challenge to Hutu, this is before the genocide, racist mobilization intensified to launch an all-out assault on the Tutsi, calling upon citizens to kill the quote-unquote cockroaches or send their corpses back up the river to Ethiopia. So blatant hate-filled racism, such as the hate speech spread through Hutu radio in Rwanda, was most certainly a factor in the Rwandan genocide. But racism was also adapted to local conditions. There was a lot of emphasis in the broadcast upon agricultural means, upon clearing the fields. This was meant to signal eliminating your Tutsi neighbors, associating it with Hutu traditional practices of agriculture, since Hutu were long associated, not exclusively, but long associated with agricultural practices. So the racism has to fit locally. It has to make sense locally, but it also is entwined with other factors like politics in this case. Now, turning quickly to Canada and the US, racism was also mobilized to support forced assimilation policies designed to destroy Indigenous groups. Canadian residential and US federal boarding schools were founded on an idea of civilization. This word civilization stood as an answer to the so-called quote-unquote Indian problem, which in both countries amounted to little more than the desire to divest indigenous peoples of their lands and identities. Racism, therefore, was in this instant instrumental to newcomers' desire to expropriate indigenous lands. Now, the idea of civilization served to unite two ideas that were not opposed but weren't necessarily in full agreement. On the one hand were those who saw indigenous cultures as ungodly and heathen, but the people, or rather their souls, as salvageable. Their hope was that indigenous people could be forcibly remade in the image of European Christians through their immersion in the disciplinary spaces of boarding schools. On the other hand, were those who portrayed indigenous peoples as in a backward stage of a sort of Darwinian evolutionary process. For this group, schools could only encourage gradual change among indigenous peoples who were held to be best suited for lower occupations and to have less intellectual capacity, according to this perspective. Now, with both of these groups, oh, thank you, sorry. I ignored that for a little while, didn't I? With both of these groups, racism and racialized thinking took different forms, but policymakers were able to unite them under these vaguer, broader banners of civilization and assimilation, bringing the projects together. And in Canada, one can see much evidence of explicit or blatant racism in the way teachers, superintendents, government officials sometimes talk about their students. This is in the archival materials that I've been looking at. But also more subtle variants of racism were also present in these schools as Europeans used some of their own assumptions about how the world works, how the world is ordered. For example, their assumptions about the benevolence of education and of religion, of these things as almost universal goods that are unquestionable. So they had trouble perceiving the harm, or at least they claimed to have trouble perceiving the harm. I don't want to give them an out here. But they were able to claim to have trouble perceiving the harm, even though evidence was mounting of deaths within the schools, of unhappy parents, of unhappy students, of runaways, of sickness, of suffering children, and so forth. So they were able to deny all this obvious evidence through this worldview that was entrenched. Well, I can, period. The point of all this, and I'll conclude here, is not to suggest by presenting the worst case scenario that our contemporary forms of racism may at any moment blend into an outright genocidal assault. And here's a plug if you want to talk about genocide in Canada more or to hear more about it. On Thursday on this campus in Marshall McLuhan Hall, Thursday, September 20th at 2:30 p.m., we'll have several speakers talking about residential schools and the question of genocide. But my point is not to say that at any moment genocide could emerge, nor is it to simply say that if we stop racism, genocides will come to an end. Sadly, there are many forms of difference-making that can be employed to designate a group a target for genocidal destruction. Rather, I want to emphasize that subtle and covert forms of racism can be used, I'm just restating my points here, can be used during genocides by various groups of actors, whether for purposes of pursuing political power, too much alliteration, economic advantage, or for purifying their own sense of identity. And these subtle forms have to align with local cultural tendencies. The second point is that racism is not the only strategy involved here. It's not all about racism, but this is entwined with other aspects to create animosity towards a targeted group, whether it's despising them because they're also poor, or they're perceived to be rich, or because of their other aspects of culture, or for whatever other reasons. We see multiple factors usually at play in genocide. That racism alone is not a single explanatory factor. So, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Our third speaker is James Wilson. I'm really pleased that Jamie has agreed to come tonight. He's a University of Manitoba alumnus, treaty commissioner. Jamie has a master's degree from the University of Manitoba. In addition, he holds multicultural and multi-subject teaching credentials and his teaching experience in grades kindergarten through 12. He's served as a school counselor, curriculum developer, cultural awareness trainer. As a traditionalist, Jamie has advocated for the equality of women in ceremony and in leadership. He was specifically honored in the Manitoba Legislature in April of 2010 for his outstanding accomplishments while Director of Education for the Opaskwayak Education Authority. In 2010, Jamie was appointed Treaty Commissioner for the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. Please join me in welcoming James Wilson.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for attending. How many of you here are students? Holy smokes, that's excellent. Thank you, students, yeah, for being here. And I'm sure there was no attendance taken. It had nothing to do with your profs. Now, I want to kind of personalize the conversation a bit, but I want to preface it by saying that I have white privilege. Given my background, my dad is Cree, my mom is Scottish. Because of my light skin color, I can walk into a room and for the most part, people generally don't really know my ethnicity, and I can use that to my advantage if I need to, and that shapes my experience in discussing racism. And I also wanted to acknowledge, I forgot to acknowledge that we were on Treaty 1 territory. Now, throughout my life, I've experienced and witnessed a couple of different kinds of racism. The first I wanted to talk about was, I used to be in the military, and this was a racism of very overt. So I joined the US military, fresh out of getting a degree in multicultural, multilingual education. Went to the US, went through basic with a bunch of really kids right out of high school from Alabama, Southern Georgia, all of that. I heard it, I was just like, holy smokes, I didn't know people talk like this. On a personal level also, when people found out I was Native, all of my leadership was like, oh, you're Native, you're a super soldier. You'll be able to walk through the woods and not make noise. And all this stuff, right? So again, I took advantage of that and used it for all I could. But one of the things that was a racism to me based on ignorance, because these young guys, these young soldiers that I served with, were very open to being educated, and they treated you based on your performance, and their expectations were exceptionally high. And I did really well in the military. I was the distinguished undergraduate for basic training, advanced infantry training. I went on and I served in the 75th Ranger Regiment. I did really well. Now, I eventually went back to school, got out of the military, went back to school, and I experienced a different form of racism. And I remember going in to see a prof, and the prof said to me, oh, I didn't realize you were First Nations. And I could just see the gears going in her head. And it was, all of her expectations of me just dropped. All of a sudden, I could hand my papers in late. All of a sudden, it was expected that I would show up to class late. It was expected that I came to class with all this baggage, that I was a disadvantaged student. And my background, I'll tell you, my parents both have their doctorates. My older sister has her doctorate from Harvard, and my older brother has his doctorate from Southern Cross University in Australia. But given that human beings that we are, my mind was going, oh, I'm going to take advantage of this. So I handed my papers in late, showed up late to class, and I lowered my personal expectations. Now, to me, the racism of lowered expectations is it's an insidious, dangerous form of racism. And it's also a racism that we as Aboriginal people participate in ourselves. It's not just the other. It's not just blamed on mainstream society. We have concepts in the First Nation community of Indian time. To me, that's a perfect example of the racism of lowered expectations. That things can start late. It's an expectation that things can start late, and to me, that's just not acceptable. If any of you have ever been on a trap line and worked with the elders and worked with trappers, you would know that doing things late is absolutely not acceptable. That's way below standard. How am I doing? Good? No sign yet? Okay. And it plays itself out in our school systems, this racism of lowered expectations. And I've seen it as an administrator, as a teacher and administrator. I've seen kids. I remember one example, a kid in grade 5. There was other kids in the classroom. This is on reserve school. One of the kids was doing really well, and they started getting teased. They started getting teased by their co-students, and they said, their co-students were saying, "You're acting white because you're getting really high grades." To me, this again is internalized form of the racism of lowered expectations, and it's something we really, really have to battle. There's broader implications that get into culture and attaching cultural ceremonies only to disadvantaged students, but I won't get into that. It opens up a whole new dialogue. So, now, one of the ways I think to address this is through education. When people realize the high standard that First Nations people lived and expected of ourselves, when First Nations people celebrate the many students we have here, at the University of Manitoba that are doing exceptionally well and excelling, their expectations of the relationship begin to rise. Because a lot of times when we have a dialogue about Aboriginal students, the dialogue is only about the struggling students. It's only about the students that are not thriving. And we need to include students that are doing exceptionally well in that dialogue, because it reinforces that whole racism of lowered expectations. So that it's critically important that we learn about each other, and that we maintain expectations of each other that aren't based on preconceived notions and lowered expectations, basically, and I'll end it with that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. Our fourth panelist tonight is Emma LaRocque, who is a Plains Cree Métis originally from northeastern Alberta, a scholar, an author, a poet, and a professor of Native Studies here at UM. She received the Alexander Kennedy Isbister Award in 2011 for nonfiction for the book When the Other Is Me, Native Resistance Discourse, 1850 to 1990. She's received national and international recognition, has presented papers and poetry in Australia, England, Hawaii, throughout North America. She's been a leading figure in the growth and development of Native studies as a teaching discipline and an intellectual field of study. She's active as a professor, researcher, writer, and human rights activist, and she was a recipient of the 2005 National Aboriginal Achievement Award. Please join me in welcoming Emma LaRocque.
Thank you very much. This is an honor, and this is not how I was welcomed 35 years ago. That's really, truly how long I've been here. Holy smokes. There's nothing for me to talk about. They've all said it. That's the problem with coming in late. No, I mean at the end. Oh, and by the way, James, I wanted to welcome you to Red River Métis country. Colonization means that some form of invasion, dispossession, and subjugation of a peoples has occurred or is continuing to occur. Racism is discrimination based on the belief that one or one's group is innately or genetically superior to another. Racists believe that race determines qualities such as intelligence, innovation, even morality and beauty. colonization is maintained by creating racial stereotypes. As been said already, racism may be expressed individually or systemically. To me, it is very important to understand that racism against the Aboriginal peoples, and by Aboriginal peoples, I mean it inclusively, First Nation, Inuit, and Métis, that racism against Aboriginal peoples is embedded and entrenched in Canadian thinking, in Canadian institutions. All major institutions, churches, courts, legislation, education, the medical institution, and so on. The media, the marketplace, oh, how could I forget? For example, there is racism in the school system, which can be traced back to the Euro-Canadian interpretation of history, a biased interpretation which has been uncritically transmitted in the education system. Historically, as someone already said, Europeans categorized themselves as the civilized and Aboriginal peoples as the savages. The underlying assumption was and is, and because it's still there, is that as savages, Indians were at the bottom of human development, and from this has come a complex of images, terminology, policies, and legislation that sets Indians apart, which is why there is an Indian Act, and as inferior. This complex, whoops, my notes, what happened to my notes? This complex has this complex of the Civ-Sav complex has far-reaching ramifications. For example, the word settler. Euro-Canadians are constantly and seemingly eternally and relentlessly always defined as settlers. Even academics, even native academics everywhere, refer to the settler society. Well, let's think about it. What is this really saying? That Indigenous peoples were not settled? That only European peoples know about settlement? Colonial records roar with the mythology that Indians roamed and ranged rather than inhabited the land. They roared because it became a convenient ideology to justify dispossession, to develop a myth that Indigenous peoples knew nothing about civility, about civitas, about settling. There are many ways of settling. Europeans cannot own that concept, and they do not own it. Because very quickly, Europeans developed the farmer over the hunter idea, that farmers have a moral and divine right to dispossess, quote, hunters. And today, that is the reason why Aboriginal peoples have had difficulty getting recognized to be self-governing. That is the reason why they constantly have to fight for land and resource rights. That is the reason why urban, agricultural, and industrial incursion continues to take place. I have to rush. Colonization, racism, they are like twins. They have had a disastrous, catastrophic impact on Indigenous peoples. Not only did First Nation peoples here in this country lose 98% of their lands, they, as a result, continue to suffer all the gamut of socioeconomic and health problems. And what can we say about the Métis? Métis basically lost everything. They don't even have treaties. They have contracts, but the Canadian government still basically refuses to acknowledge it. But racism takes its human toll. It dehumanizes people. It dehumanizes the targets of racism. Oh, I can stand here all day and tell you stories about the racism I have experienced. I will leave it to my memoirs, only thing is my memory is going. So. It dehumanizes people. For those conditioned to be racist towards Aboriginal people, they may develop racial hatred, fear, distrust, and all these are very dangerous elements. For those who are victims of racism, it can develop racial shame and self-rejection and self-hate. Racism is consubstantial to sexism. Why are Aboriginal women murdered and missing? Think of the word squaw. Where do you think it comes from? From the fur trade days when Indigenous women were dismissed, abused, debased, and often simply and extremely racistly and sexistly, I know those are not words, but they're poetic, that they were called, in those words, from a place of hate and racism, and they have suffered enormously. Racism drains people, it drains resources. So why are Canadians reluctant to talk about racism? As I have seen so many times, as I have heard and read, Canadians are not only reluctant to talk about racism, but often they limit acknowledgement of its existence to black-white situations. And please don't misunderstand, I do not begrudge that the fact that there would be some acknowledgement of racism against other people, other non-white, non-native people. But I've often wondered, why is there no acknowledgement or very little acknowledgement that there is racism against Aboriginal people? I believe that there are a number of reasons, and I'm just going to quickly go over them, that the belief that racism is passé, a relic of the 19th century thinking. It also justifies privilege. Privilege exacted from the colonization of Aboriginal peoples. It's a way to ease guilt. Stereotypes are developed to blame the victim, to ease guilt, to explain social issues, and racism in that context then gets watered down and whitewashed as cultural differences. You cannot talk about Aboriginal people today without almost immediately tripping over that phrase, cultural difference, or cultural this, cultural that. Aboriginal peoples do have real cultures, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how culture has been used as a way to hide and mask and even defend racism. Racism is not just a word. Colonization is not just an historical study. Racism, colonialism is an experience. And as an experience, it is incredibly destructive. As I say, I could spend hours and hours telling you that I know personally, and I know socially, and also I know as an academic how terribly destructive racism is. I think we could spend some time trying to understand why people are racist, We know how it works. We know people take it on. But why do they? I don't have any answers offhand. I don't have time. But I think it is important. That might be something else we could do. But in any case, I think we've convinced you that racism is very important to talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emma. That brings us to the end of the first part of our time together. And the next part now, we want to be a conversation that includes my colleagues here and those of you in the audience. So as I indicated before, if you want to make a comment, ask a question, please raise your hand, and someone with a microphone will find you. So I see a gentleman here about halfway back in the middle on this side. Yeah, there's a microphone coming from behind you.
Hi. Oh, is it on?
Hello?
It's on.
Oh, okay. It's just not pointing right at me. Hello. First of all, I'd like to thank the last speaker for using little quotation marks whenever she said Indian, because I personally don't like being called an Indian. If I was from India, maybe I probably wouldn't mind it. There's nothing wrong with being an Indian. It's just that my ancestors were not from India. But quick story, then a question. So in 2006, I was a temp working in a variety of blue-collar environments, factories, warehouses, and in the course of 2 months, I came across 3 different people who were sort of angry at me because either they or a friend of theirs they couldn't get into the City of Winnipeg Police Department, like they didn't make the cut to become recruits, and what I sort of my idea of what was happening was that there was a recruiter in the Winnipeg Police Service basically scapegoating First Nations people because what they told me is, either I couldn't get in or my friend couldn't get in because they have to hire an Indian. So yeah, I thought maybe someone is scapegoating natives, and also when native police officers go out there to protect people, they're going to face challenges because there's people who now think that either they or their friends couldn't become police officers because of affirmative action. So my question is, have any of you given any thought to what can be done about when affirmative action is perceived as a form of reverse discrimination?
That's a good question. Does anyone want to start with that? Jamie?
You want me to jump in on that?
Oh, I just want to say a quick little thing. Obviously, I don't call First Nation people Indians, but in a certain context, you have to use that word to explain imagery that is used in, the imaginary Indian, etc. Secondly, I think the charge about reverse racism is it's a denial tactic. It's a backlashing tactic. And I see racism as not just an attitude, but because it is embedded in powerful institutions, it is a very powerful arm. And it is used to legitimate unequal relationships. When groups are socially, economically, in every other way unequal, they can't be equally racist. So there's a certain point where oppressed people really have no power. They may have negative attitudes, but to me the issue is about power. We have to disempower racism.
Jamie?
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about affirmative action because in some regards, you don't want to lower the standard on the exit requirements, right? Like if I was getting onto a plane and I knew that the pilot graduated with the lower standard, I wouldn't want to get on that plane, right? Now on the other hand, society has a responsibility, especially for positions that are paid for by tax dollars, to represent the society at large. So a position like a police force should represent the population it serves. And it should remove barriers for people to get into that profession. So I'm kind of a mixed opinion on affirmative action. I kind of see both sides of the argument, as long as that standard is maintained. How come you're not a cop?
Laurie, did you want to comment? Go ahead.
I think one of the points too is that the Canadian public is woefully undereducated about employment equity and what the legislation does and how the procedures work. In reality, if you're talking about the Winnipeg Police Department, Aboriginal peoples are woefully underrepresented, as are other ethnic groups as well. So the fact that that's still going on is something that we're also woefully undereducated about. But the perception that somebody gets an extra leg up because of the color of the skin or the religion that they practice is very powerful. And how do we overcome and educate people that isn't the case? And I guess that's a question I struggle with all the time. I feel like I try to explain, give examples. I try to explain the procedures of how hiring works. I try to explain that, in university, seats go unfilled to Aboriginal peoples in some professional faculties because there actually aren't enough qualified applicants for these positions. So that said, how do we get that word out? And how do we get people to understand in a soundbite of 2 minutes or less? Because our news media doesn't do as much good either when you have to explain these things in 2 minutes. It takes a little bit more time and effort on the part of individuals to understand these things as well.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to affirmative action policies because I think they're important for the individuals who have access to them and get the experience. But on a social level, I find them an inadequate and superficial means of trying to redress the harms of colonization, obviously. They tend to create these divisions, they reinforce racial categorizations, reinforce divisions, rather than seeking means to truly sort of move more towards other desired, more transformative goals, whether it's Indigenous sovereignty or whatever is being envisioned. I don't have that vision to offer you right now, but as a strategy on its own, I feel it's limited.
Other contributions? Chris, down here.
Greetings. My name is Sue. I'm a gratefully recovering racist. I'm just kidding. No, I think really the first step to recovery is admitting your racism. And I've been in cognitive behavioral therapy for 4 years as a direct consequence of Indian residential schools and learning to reframe my belief systems about myself and the people that I live with in this country. One of the things that I saw missing in your panel is the fact that racism is a belief system, and as a belief system, it's psychological also. The fact that the little neurons that are activated when we learn something new and they connect, we can actually disconnect them. The sad thing is when we go to sleep at night, they reconnect. And so the next day we have to work hard to try and disconnect them again. It's a process, and it doesn't happen overnight. You can't just automatically stop being racist. You have to put in some effort, and you have to put in the time, and you have to be dreadfully honest with yourself. And so I just wanted to see if anybody wanted to comment on racism as a belief system in those contexts. Thanks.
All right, thanks for that. Anyone want to comment on that?
Oh, I think we all said that racism is a belief system.
Other contributions? Here, Chris?
Or at least it
I'm
has
sorry.
elements of
Oh,
that.
okay. All right. Over the back.
You hold on to it. Okay, so if I say anything culturally inappropriate, it's because I've never read a Cultural Values of Canada guide. So, like, please bear with my savagery. I think that I'd like to ameliorate the definition of racism that we're using in this place. I don't know what we call it in this country. And I think that the definition I would like to use is that there is racial prejudice combined with power, systemic power, and privilege. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. So that's the pretext of what I'm about to tell you. I think that we really need to be critical of how or who comprises the panel that we've listened to. I think that it's really interesting how we've had white voices talk to us about racism, and I think that it's really strange that we have the stories of white people, or at least the stories of people of color told by white people. And I think that we need to be critical about this and see how we've privileged white voices. And I think that further we need to analyze what this means and how we've learned about racism. And I think that I'd like you guys to comment on what you think about that.
Okay, thank you. Laurie?
Point. I think it's a very important one, but I also want to emphasize that it is very important that white people take ownership of this as well, because we are part of the problem as well. And if we don't have the courage to talk about these things, then other white people will not either. And so I face this as I teach the courses in race and ethnic relations in the sociology department. I get a lot of shocked faces when I walk into the room the first day of class. And it takes me about 3 to 6 weeks to, I guess, get my street cred. That it's great for a white person to be speaking about these things. Now, I think that we need to have a multitude of voices to speak about racism as well. So I do understand and accept your point, but I think it's equally important to have white voices speaking these things as well.
Hey. Jamie?
Yeah, a lot of the work that we do through our office, so with the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, we really engage with the school systems. So we're working to bring treaty education into Manitoba, kindergarten to grade 12. So one of the, and we're aligning that with the existing social studies curriculum, so when kids learn about citizenship, geography, identity, they're learning about treaties. Not as an add-on, but integrated with the curriculum. Now, one of the biggest barriers that we have is that there's a lot of non-native teachers that are scared to talk about Aboriginal issues. They're scared to tackle anything even remotely controversial because they're scared of being labeled racist. And it completely disempowers them. So instead of even looking at these issues, they'll just skim over it. And as a teacher, you've got a high school class. You're supposed to have 110 hours of instruction. In reality, you get about 95. So you're always chopping things. First thing to go is always the thing that makes you uncomfortable. So it's important that not only we make people of whatever their ethnicity comfortable to talk about these issues, but that we also, it's more than comfort, it's also a responsibility. So it's not just a comfort issue, it's their responsibility to tackle these issues.
Okay. Jim, did you want to come?
I think there's a difference between white people who assume the voice of people of color. I'm not quite easy with that phrase. And that I find very disturbing. If they are assuming the voice, they are appropriating the voice and the experience. But I think there's a difference between that and those people who are educators and who are also very concerned individuals who happen to be white, and that they really help advancing the education of those people who are just closed to a discussion of racism. And you know, I do believe that it is not just for Aboriginal people to clean up the Colonial Act, that's for sure.
Thank you. Here, Chris? Oh, I'm sorry. Andrew, bye.
Sorry, if I could just say something, because there's a moment of contradiction in your statement, because you have to take the voice of other people in order to make that statement. You make yourself a spokesperson for others in order to examine the composition of the panel. But that's fine, because I assume you do it out of a notion of responsibility, a responsibility to speak out against a potential injustice. And I think that's a similar compulsion that we all feel. I certainly did not want to focus my dissertation back when I was a graduate student on Indigenous newcomer relations in British Columbia, but given my own background, given that I was embedded in these colonial institutions, I felt a responsibility, a compulsion to begin to examine that, not as placing myself in the voice or the standpoint of Indigenous peoples, but as a person who's part of that newcomer population who was on, Douglas Treaty land that was, basically stolen from the Indigenous peoples on Vancouver Island, where I grew up. So hopefully that helps succinctly answer.
Thank you.
I just wanted to address the lower expectations. I think those positions are not lowered expectations. They're recognizing that as a group that's in poverty, living, quite a ways from higher education, that more effort has to be put in supporting the students or the person that's going to be a police person, and recognizing that there's a lot of dropout because of what's happening within the school, within the society that they're living in. So it's not a lowered expectation. I don't, I'm really troubled by hearing that.
Yep.
Do you want to respond?
Yep. I had a really good discussion today about just this very thing, because a good example of First Nation students coming from an on-reserve setting. Because you have on-reserve schools that are funded anywhere from 30 to 40% less than the provincial counterparts, so you get less access to options in high school, higher teacher-student ratios. There's no legislation governing education on reserve. So you have this whole gamut of things that create disadvantage for these students, right? So they're disadvantaged students. So how do you respond to that? Do you respond to that by lowering the expectation, by saying, okay, you can graduate grade 12 without being able to read or write properly? No, you keep your expectations high, but it's almost, you refocus your efforts and give those students the extra support they need, right? Because we all know there's students that are disadvantaged, and you have to help them and support them. Yeah, I know it's controversial, but yeah. No, I'm from Opaskwayak Cree Nation, Northern Manitoba.
I read in publications about controversy around lowered expectations when there was towards black people being allowed into, say, a privileged university, a place of higher learning, and less understanding students being resentful about that fact. saying that they don't belong here. You know, they got in through lowered expectations, and we had to work for our entrance into this place. And I've also heard Black people saying that this is doing a disservice to the Black people of this nation to have, you know, lowered expectations. So
It's a complex issue. All right, let's go up here to the back corner.
Hi. First of all, I just want to say about the affirmative action issue that it is nothing to do with the lowered standards. So I'm actually really surprised to hear that. We don't have quotas in Canada. Affirmative action only applies after people have met the basic qualifications. And I've certainly never seen anything where a lower standard is accepted in place of anything else. So affirmative action is just one tool that we have to use in assessing admissions in a different way than they've been looked at in the past. So I don't believe that to be true at all. But my main point is that I'm interested that when we're talking about covert racism, the examples I heard from you guys are actually what I would say are pretty overt. A picture of white sheep kicking out a black sheep isn't covert to me, that's an obvious message. Covert racism is something that I think is really difficult for people who are not persons of color to grasp, because it's something that happens in such a subtle level that you could never take it to Human Rights Commission, you could never take it to court. I graduated from Faculty of Law last year, here, and I experienced plenty of covert racism from people that would probably be the first to tell you they're anti-racism and super liberal. From the first time I walked in there, people found out I had children. Are you a single mother? Were you special access? Again, the assumptions. And I found it interesting that the gentleman said that people don't think that you're Aboriginal, because as soon as I saw you, to me, you were obviously Aboriginal. And for me, I think I'm obviously a person of color, but when people say to you that they're not seeing you that way, to me it's because of their expectations and their perceptions of what an Aboriginal person, a person of color looks like. So you're wearing a suit, you speak well, you must be white. It's not that you look white, it's just that they assume that persons of color don't appear professional or articulate. I experienced that a lot, and I know that I don't look white, but I've been told that, and I think it's because people perceive that I act white, which is a whole other level of racism. And I think that the subtle racism happens in things like you go to a job interview, and it's for a legal job, and they talk to you about hockey for 10 minutes, and you have to play along and sort of pretend that you like hockey. And then they say, oh, you were really smart, you had great qualifications, but you're not a good fit for our firm. So that's racist. But the way it's phrased, you can never actually come out and accuse someone of that. If you do that, it's only going to be negative towards you. So these are things that I find the higher up the social scale you go, it's actually worse. And I think people have an expectation that people who experience racism are, it affects the lower classes and poor people. And if you're not poor, then you can't talk about it. I've been told that too, that, oh, don't talk about racism in class because, you know, you're privileged. Like, you're better off than a lot of white people, so, you know, who are you to complain? So I think that personally I would like to hear voices from the last speaker, from people who are visible minorities in Canada that do live this every day and can actually speak to the dynamics that other people aren't seeing going on because they think they're just making conversation. So.
Okay. Any response? No? Okay.
I totally agree with you. I think that people who claim to be colorblind is a different and another form of racism that we can speak about as well. But I think I can give you another example of covert racism based on a study that was conducted 18 months ago at the University of Toronto. This group there sent out 6,000 resumes. Now, 3,000 resumes were exactly the same. They had the same name, same qualifications, sent out to different kinds of jobs. Another 3,000 resumes sent out to different kinds of jobs had a different name. That name was non-Anglophone. The chances of you getting employed, or first of all, the chances of you getting called for an interview were 5 times greater if you had the white name than if you had the, as an Anglophone person, unpronounceable non-Anglophone name. When it came to the interview, when the people showed up for the interview, because they had students sitting in for these interviews who were qualified for the jobs that they were being interviewed for, the white person was 2.5 times more likely to get that job than the person who wasn't white. And it's that kind of racism, that kind of proof that is very difficult to get. I mean, these people had to, the researchers had to work very hard to send out these 6,000 resumes and to make sure that these resumes fit the qualifications. But you can't always get that kind of proof, that kind of evidence that you need to go forward to a human rights tribunal. So you have former politicians, for instance, who distribute hate literature that goes to the provincial human rights tribunal and the national human rights tribunal, and it gets overturned even though they're blatantly racist because they can't put a finger on what exactly it is racist, because the person who's arguing, who's distributing these pamphlets, is arguing, well, I'm just criticizing the policy. I'm not a racist. In this case, the person was criticizing favoritism towards Aboriginal people, and his argument, which is weak, was that he was just criticizing the policy. I mean, another phrase you hear is, well, I can't be a racist because some of my best friends are Aboriginal people. So.
Thank you. Chris? Yeah.
I have a different take on the lowered expectation. And I really, first time I got this coined term, racism of lowered expectation. I have encountered lowered expectation, but this whole phraseology of racism coming out of it. My experience is that lowered expectation comes on the stereotypical image they have. Way back in the 60s when I came into Canada, in my sari, of course, Indian woman from India would be considered gentle, always obeying the orders, doing a perfect job, but never a candidate for a managerial job. Now, I hope that changed now, and I hope they see me now not as gentle as they thought I was. But still, I'm in my sari. So, and I remember way back in the 60s being asked, are you sure you can walk in a sari, you can go to work in a sari? I said, that question never occurred to me. I can't change my skin, so why do I have to change my costume? So all those dialogues have been there because of the stereotypical image they have. And it's interesting, Indians, of course, we are all here, whether you come from India or native Indians here. Each one of us in a light way or in a very, very deep, affecting way have encountered this because of that lowered expectation of me as an individual. They already have slaughtered me. But the reverse is, who should try to raise that expectation? The onus is placed on me now to show, as a woman, I can be as aggressive as man. Or as an Indian person, I can be as whatever as this other person is. The onus then is placed on what I would call the victims, rather than the persons who is coming up with that expectation to say, that person can do as good as this person. So I actually welcome this comment, racism of lowered expectation. If we can only recognize that, if we can expect more, I will rise up to that. I think that is the, one way we should attack this perennial situation that we face. And also, it leads on to lowered expectation of ourselves then, as you pointed out. So
Did you want to respond? Are you okay with that? Okay. Is there someone up at the back? She spoke. Thank you. Pardon? Well, I think we're heading towards the person up at the back.
First of all, thank you very much for being here, all of you. I am interested in the opinion of the panel with regard to cultural identity and racism in the internet age. You can go to many of the mass media websites and you see the most vitriolic, nasty, hateful messages all across the board. It doesn't just deal with lowest common denominator sites like YouTube. Sorry if there are fans of YouTube here. but well-reputed websites like the Atlantic or any other magazine or a large news provider. So I am interested in your opinion on that, and whether or not the internet is helping to hurt advances in eradicating racism. My other question was, and I'll try to make this really quick because it's different, is it deals with the economic incentive and economic advancement for those who benefit from white privilege and racism in general, and whether or not we have a truly effective countermeasure to white privilege. Because I hear affirmative action being tossed around quite often, but setting that aside for a second, because I kind of feel that's a very old issue, people, regardless of their ethnic background, tend to be comfortable around people of the same ethnic background because of the fact that they've grown up in the household most often with people of the same ethnic background. So there's this benign white privilege, if you will, where people are just naturally comfortable with the people who they look like. So how do we change that effectively without really violating their right to be comfortable around whoever they choose to be comfortable around?
Thank you. Two very thoughtful and different questions. Let's, can we respond, panelists, to the internet issue, media? Andrew, do you want to start?
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to point you to a really interesting master's thesis that was just completed in sociology a few weeks back by a guy named Evan Bonus, who did an intensive discourse analysis of CBC and other websites after racialized policing events that led to the death in all cases of in 3 cases of an Indigenous man, and in one case, in another one, the Fresh IE case, where there was no death, but he was simply pulled over because he was racially profiled. And I mean, the comments were, I never read the comments, but once I did, it was an amazing disappointment about the internet's potential as a public sphere, especially with the anonymous format, that simply it is a place in where racists can find other racists to reaffirm their views and get thumbs up or likes or whatever the various mechanisms are. So just on that issue, you should check out Evan's work.
Laurie?
It's also a forum where people who would never say these things in public are free to and encouraged to do so. So you have sites like CNN which allow you to put in some ridiculous nickname, and then you can spout off whatever you want until somebody cuts your comments off. And so I think that that's precisely why we need to talk about racism, because it is significantly more predominant than Canadians like to think. And so these kinds of thoughts and feelings and comments build and feed into these more insidious forms of racism that develop and are help position people who are in power. To get to kind of your second point, with regards to how society is structured and encourages groups of people to spend time with one another, and that there's not a lot of impetus in many institutions to discourage that. And so I think that we need to take a multi-pronged approach. I mean, we've been taking the approach that racism is dealt with in the education system. You learn how to be a good citizen. You learn that racism is bad. Well, by the time you get to school, most of those feelings and beliefs are actually embedded into you by your parents. And so, and it's also, if you take just one institution and focus your efforts on anti-racism there, it's not going to help the other institutions either. So we have, because we focus so much on one institution, we still have problems in employment and unequal life chances. We have problems with unequal access to health. We have problems with relation to equal representation in our parliaments, in our legislatures, and our municipal politics.
Jamie?
Yeah. Now, I have a monthly column in the Winnipeg Free Press, and usually I try to write about building bridges, creating understanding between the First Nations community and all other Canadians. Now, anything First Nations related, if you go on the Winnipeg Free Press website, you look at the comments, and it's a real eye-opener, right? I'd like to say I don't read the comments on my articles, but I do. And if you take a political approach, they say there's the kind of the extremists on whatever political spectrum, right? And then there's the people in the middle. Now our target audience that we want to engage with are the people in the middle. The problem with the internet is the most vocal people are usually the people on the extreme. But it does allow you, it does allow you a really rough gauge of if you're getting at that middle audience. Although you have to recognize that it is the extremes that will be doing 99% of the comments. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think that's helpful. Just an observation as a computer scientist, I think this technology gives us the potential of an amazing public space. But in practice, what often happens is a very fragmented space where people self-select to participate in conversations that reinforce what they already think, rather than opening themselves up to dialogue, right? We're getting close to the end, folks, so let's take another question. A comment?
So my question is actually for you, Dr. Bernard. I
Yes.
just wanted to ask you, what is the U of M itself doing to dismantle racism in our institutions, so at the individual level? Or what plans are ahead?
Well, thank you for that. On a number of fronts, I guess the university is trying to, by tonight's activities, for example, raise the issue and make ourselves conscious of it. We have certainly, with respect to the real gap between First Nations people, between Indigenous people and others, have tried to participate, I think, in as transparent and responsible a way as we could in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, and the spillover of that thinking into our own thinking about what does it mean as a university to pursue the notion of reconciliation between Indigenous people and newcomers. And that's a project that's going to take a long time, but I think a number of people in the room are heavily engaged in it. So I think by this kind of activity, by that kind of activity, and trying to increase our own awareness of the issue and face it as a reality. And in addition, of course, the people who are faculty members, I think raising it as a part of the educational content of what happens at the university. Now,
Can I add it?
Sure.
I think the apology that the university issued last year, or that was this year or last year?
that was a year ago.
Last year, I mean, that's commendable. That as a First Nations person,
Well, appreciate the affirmation on that. That was the work of, while I got to make the statement, it was a statement that was prepared with the help of a good number of people, some of whom are in the room tonight, so it's very definitely a team effort. There's one right behind you, Chris, and then we'll close off because I'm going to ask Digbert to make some summary comments and we'll end.
Well, there are a couple of things I'd like to mention before we close here. Is there anything good we can say about Canada in regards to multiculturalism, tolerance, and get along with other cultures? That's one question I want to ask you. The other one is, I'm a first-generation immigrant. I came here in 1962, blistering hot night on Higgins Avenue. That was a CP station then. And ever since, I had a 30-year teaching career, very successfully, and I taught a lot of Native kids. And I want to tell you, the Native kids are as smart, as intelligent, as creative, as fun-loving, as cooperative, like lots of them. They are as good as the Polish kids, as the Russian kids, as the Chinese kids, as the Spanish kids, as the German kids. There is no difference between them. They're all the same. But I'm going to tell you something that I said at staff meetings, and I'm going to say it now too. There's one thing they don't have. They don't have the proper parenting.
Proper parenting.
I had proper parenting. And just before you close, Mr. President, I just wanted to make a comment. Do not think that just because Canada has this truth and reconciliation thing going, that somehow the issues facing Aboriginal people are being addressed. But I want to speak especially as a Métis person. Métis people are among the most forgotten, the most invisibilized, most marginalized, most poor people in this country. We are not all treaty people. And we did not all go to residential school. I come from a long line of Métis people who have suffered enormously and profoundly, lost lands here in Red River and continue to lose them in Western Canada, and basically got pushed into the hinterland, which is fine, we loved it, and I now wish I could go back, except I have no skills. But, you know, I don't mean to disparage, I mean, I guess it's a good thing, and I don't mean to disparage the experience of people with residential school. I know, I mean, before it became an academic trend, I was studying it 30 years ago here at the university and nobody paid attention. But it does trouble me that to latch onto residential school as if that is the only problem, as if that's the only experience, as if somehow if we talk about it and understand it, everything else is going to get worked out. Well, I don't know the numbers offhand, but I believe that the majority of Aboriginal people, both First Nation and Métis and Inuit, did not go to residential schools. But we still faced cultural genocide. We still faced poverty. We still faced and continue to face racism and marginalization. And when I look at truth and reconciliation meetings happening, what I see is Aboriginal people going there and expressing themselves, which is good, but I do not see white people going there and saying, hey, how about we do some restitution? Because there is no reconciliation without justice. And there is no reconciliation without restitution. And Canada is not going to be a whole country unless all Aboriginal people's concerns are on the table. And I really take offense to you, sir, saying that Aboriginal people, Aboriginal children did not have proper parenting. I had wonderful, well, more or less one. I mean, you know, my parents were human, but I had good parenting.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'm going to end. Appreciate what you were saying. Thank you, Emma, on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think the whole concept of reconciliation as a once-for-all closing of accounts is a simplistic assumption, right? We live in a dynamic reality, and we'll be grappling with these issues for a long time. Digver, closing comments.
Thank you, David. I too also extend welcome for you to be here tonight to the first visionary conversation of the year. As you have heard from four distinguished people who have worked in this field, it's a very complex issue. And as you also know, the topic tonight was mentioned as we need to talk about racism, not as a question, do we need to talk about racism? If it was a question, the answer would be yes, we need to talk about racism. But question was worded that we need to talk about it. And the reason why we need to talk about it is it was pointed out by the panelists that racism directed to individuals or to groups promotes the stereotypes, costs socially and economically, as it leads people to be underemployed, unemployed, have poor health, have poor educational outcomes, and have lowered personal expectations. And these things cannot be good for the society. And in worst case scenario, racism intertwined with a multitude of local factors can lead to genocide. And that certainly is not acceptable in any civilized society. So I think in closing, what I want to say is that we need to commit to talk about racism and commit to intervene when it is noticed, because it is more prevalent in Canada than we think it is.
Thank you, Digver. And I want to thank all of the panelists, appreciate their contributions, and all of you in the audience for coming. Thank you for being part of this. It is an important conversation, and it will be an ongoing conversation. We'll be back here again on October 9th with the next visionary conversation about innovation and its impact on the economy, and I would hope to see many of you there. There are other events, as I mentioned at the beginning, going on this week that are part of the University of Manitoba's homecoming celebration. You can look at that on our website at umanitoba.ca. Thank you for coming, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night.